much for joining us for the Help and Hope podcast produced by MARKINC Ministries. I'm Sharon Betters, your host, and our vision is to share stories, redemption stories, about people who have experienced some of the most broken places of life, crises that are sometimes experienced in isolation and that seem desperately hopeless. And yet the stories that we share show that there is hope and there can be joy in the darkness. And the conversations are designed not just to help the person who is hurting, but also to equip those who love them to come alongside of them and walk with them in what could be very dark places. Did you know that, according to one study, 1 in 7 women are going to experience postpartum depression after giving birth within the first year of giving birth? That does not include miscarriages, that's live births. That equates to about 600,000 women who are going to experience this very dark and broken place. It is a place where a generation ago was not even recognized really as a valid illness. Women who experienced postpartum depression my age didn't know what was going on with them, and often there would be advice and counsel that just was not helpful, and she struggled alone. But today, more attention is being given to postpartum depression, and that's why I'm so excited to have our guest today, Chappell, who understands postpartum depression. Christine is a wife and a mother. She is a writer. She is a speaker. But most of all, Christine has a story to tell, and she wants to tell it in a way that helps turn hearts toward Jesus in some of the most broken places of life. And so as we talk, I'll share a little bit more about my relationship to Christine and some of the partnering that we've done in ministry. But Christine, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sharon. It's great to be back on the Help and Hope podcast.
Yes, and Christine is the host of the Hope and Help podcast.
Yes.
So we decided the last time Christine was on the podcast, or I might have been on her podcast, I don't know, that if somebody was doing a search and either one came up, it would be okay.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, you'll land in a good spot.
Yes. And I highly recommend the Hope and Help podcast. Check it out. Love the guests that Christine has on her podcast. And they go deep. Christine, you go deep in your conversations, and I really appreciate that. So, Christine, you have been on the podcast before, and we talked about depression in young moms. And today we're going to drill a little deeper. You have written a booklet called, I want to get it right, Postpartum Depression, Hope for a Hard Season. It's not a big book, but it is really packed with hope and help. And so as we jump in, tell us what postpartum depression is. There might be some people who are thinking, I have no idea what they're talking about. So what is postpartum depression?
Sure. Well, and I want to preface my answer with just stating the obvious, which is I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a licensed therapist or anything like that. And so when I speak to depression, and specifically even postpartum depression, I'm not coming at it from that angle, coming at it more from one who has suffered through this type of affliction, but also as a biblical counselor. So one who desires to comfort others with the comfort I've received from God through his word and spirit. And so having said that, from a medical perspective, postpartum depression is often defined as a complex mix of physical, emotional, and behavior challenges that happen in some women after giving birth. And so usually within the first 4 weeks after delivery, when there are these symptoms that are present that are according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is also known as the DSM-5, which is the book that doctors use to diagnose mental disorders. But within the first 4 weeks, some of these more distressing symptoms will become apparent. And so it's not necessarily something that, when you're child is 2 years old, you're going to be diagnosed with, but it's really like taking a look at that newborn phase, the first 4 or 6 weeks after delivery, and what the severity of the symptoms of depression are during that time.
Mm. So, I'm glad you said that, that you're not coming here as a doctor, but as someone who has experienced it. So, tell us about your journey for postpartum. I mean, I remember I had a friend who went through this, and I didn't know how to help her. I had never seen a woman experience such deep sorrow and heartbreak after the birth of a child. And I just had no idea how to help her. So I'm intrigued by your story. Tell us a little bit about what happened with you after the birth of your baby.
Yeah, well, and Sharon, aren't we all intrigued of why on earth, after, something that most of us regard as a blessing, would we experience such debilitating sorrow? In fact, as I was writing this mini book, I was taken aback because my youngest daughter, who is actually the child through which I did experience postpartum depression. Now, the first two, I did not struggle in that particular way. So that even kind of compounded the shame of it all, because I was like, goodness gracious, this is child number 3. If anyone should be kind of familiar with what comes with the territory, it's me. Why am I struggling like this? And so as I was writing, my 9-year-old daughter comes up and says, Mom, what are you working on? And I say, well, a book for, and I'm talking in her language, I say, a book for moms who are sad after they've had their baby. I'm not trying to say too much about it to her because she's little. And she looks at me and she says, Mom, why would someone be sad after having their baby? And that was the child, Sharon, who 9 years previously, I was that mom after her birth, struggling with those very same questions. Why am I feeling this way? I should be happy and productive and joyful. And yeah, motherhood is hard, and newborn motherhood is hard in particular, but why am I feeling so overwhelmed and distraught and hopeless? And so I just say that little anecdote to kind of give you a little bit of my mindset at the time with our daughter, because I didn't feel like I should have been struggling. Right. I should have been a pro, like a motherhood pro by now. After the third child, you think that maybe your experience can kind of guard you from some of these pitfalls and this type of suffering, but not necessarily so in my own experience. And so I think there were a lot of different factors at play, and I don't ever talk about this type of struggle in the past as though I've figured out what the problem was and here's what you can do to not have the problem. But in hindsight, I think we do learn, right? We do get perspective and see different things that were hard. And I think that, for me, I had an oversimplified view of my world, and maybe an oversimplified view of who I was as a person, as a mother, as a Christian even. And so God used that season in my life to grow me, but it was very painful and came with a lot of tears on the bathroom floor, came with fits of rage. I remember one time even getting to the point where I was so frustrated and overwhelmed, I kicked a hole in the wall. I mean, these are not great things to share, but there's just so much overwhelming and intense emotion, at least for me, during this time. And it was really difficult to know, like, what does that even mean? What does that even say about me? Am I a monster? I felt like that some days too, because it was so overwhelming. And so I don't know if I'm blabbering now, but that's kind of a little bit about where I was at during that time with our third child.
So, how did you find your way back to a place where you could look at your baby and enjoy the blessings of your 3 children?
Yeah, I mean, again, I wish I could say I could offer a formula, and I think that's actually one of the dangers, is to do that, because we need personalized care. And the care that God gives to us through Christ is always personal. He doesn't paint with broad brushstrokes about this is what most people need. This is, he comes to us and says, I have what you need as a unique individual and all the different stresses and pressures that you face. Because the reality is, Sharon, is that in my experience and the women that I've talked to, it's not just the pressures of newborn care that are overwhelming. There are so many other facets of this woman's experience to consider that are having an impact on how she interacts and perceives her world. We have spiritual turmoil going on. There's physical issues a lot of times at play. I know I had post-birth wounds that were really slow to heal and never really healed properly. Some women are having C-section complications, or there's been an emergency delivery. And so there's physical ailments, sometimes at play. There's relational stress, whether it's through marriage or broken relationships or other children that we have in the home. And so now we've got the burden of caring for other children, as well as maybe the children in the home are not receiving the baby well, and they're angry about another sibling. There's the baby itself who may be colicky or having its own medical issues, and this is all on top of the exhaustion, the weariness, the physical demands. There may be financial stress to worry about. She may be a single mom. There's spiritual warfare involved. I mean, there's so many other layers. And I think for me, looking back, I just had a blind eye to all of those layers and really just narrowly focused on my own failures to perform under pressure. I wasn't rising to the occasion like I thought I would. I thought I was a particular kind of mom, and this season was revealing to me my weakness, my limitation, my need, my dependence on others. And so the way through was kicking and screaming, Sharon. I mean, it was suffering. It was hard. I invited others into my struggle. I told, at the 6-month or 6-week follow-up with my doctor, I told her about, the feelings I had of wanting to, there were times that I was tempted to hurt myself. And that was already like a temptation I had had previously. So, understandably, if you're already prone to that type of response under stress, then this is a season where those types of unhelpful responses are going to be even more of a temptation. And that certainly was true for me. But then also, the grief I felt in sometimes not caring about my newborn like I thought I should, and that came with its own level of shame and despair, because you're like, this is not how a mother should be acting toward her baby. Why am I acting this way? And so time helped, because circumstances evolved. I grew, the children grew, the pressures changed. Not to say that everything was alleviated, but through, I think, just the support of others, the encouragement of community, engaging, people who could help and advise. And then plus just the Lord carrying me, bearing me up day by day, as the scriptures say, and just getting me to a point where things in my body settled and healed. And I grew some new responses, to some of those overwhelming things. But again, I don't want to say I figured out how to not ever be overwhelmed again, because that's not true. I experienced depression a lot of times after this season, so it's just a big mess, when you're in it. But God was faithful. God was faithful to surround me and carry me, even as I did not understand what was going on and could not help myself, right? He is a God who helps those who cannot help themselves. And that's definitely what I experienced.
Yeah. You said that postpartum depression always involves both your physical and spiritual being. And I think that was really helpful. You talk about it in your booklet. Can you just, briefly, what do you mean by that? And then And you've touched on it in talking about some of everything that you experienced, and of course, I've read the book, so I know the booklet. So I know some of the weapons, if you want to call it that, that you were able to implement in your own life, even though may not have changed the darkness. It was a way that helped give you some light. But talk to us about that, the spiritual and the physical, how that's entangled, and how they're not silos. All of these different, you mentioned a whole bunch of different things, like the
Mm-hmm.
physical weariness, and then the spiritual, how you viewed yourself, your identity, and all of those things are all wrapped up together. They're all entangled. And I think that when you talk about the physical and the spiritual, that'll help us understand what that means.
Yeah. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about the fact of how God created us, right? He created us from dust, and then he breathed his breath of life into us. We see that in early on in Genesis, in the creation account. And so we are embodied souls. We have spiritual matter and physical matter. We have an inner man and an outer man. We have immaterial and material beings, and it's tempting in talks about suffering and postpartum depression or depression in general to, I use the word oversimplify. We could just turn a blind eye to one component, so we view this only as a physical issue, or we go on the other end and we view this only as a spiritual issue. And to do so, I think, creates a divide that isn't necessarily there. And we want to care for ourselves, in our whole total being. And so for me, when I talk about these types of things, I like to remind people that, look, all of you needs nurturing in this season. If you are a postpartum mother struggling with depression, there will be things you can do to take care of your physical body. And then there are things that you must do to take care of your spiritual body. And I make that caveat because, Sharon, I say these are things that we must do. We must give attention to our spiritual being, because hopelessness kills. Because hopelessness, right? When our spirits are crushed, as they can be in postpartum depression, Proverbs, and forgive me for not knowing the verse off the top of my head, but Proverbs says that a healthy spirit can endure a sick body, but a crushed spirit who can bear? A crushed spirit will take down a healthy body. And so we have to pay attention to and give care to our spiritual being, because it's the essence of us, right? And so it's not to say that one is more important than the other. Both of them are needed, but we don't want to turn a blind eye. And as I say that, I'm not saying that the cause of your depression is spiritual sin. Not saying that either, right? But you are a saint in Christ. If you belong to Jesus, you are a saint in Christ, and that informs how you view and engage your world. And if you are living and breathing, then you are a sufferer, and you are responding to your environment, as a spiritual being who is suffering in a materialistic world, and then of course, in all of that, Sharon, we are always sinning. Like, there's always sinful responses at play, and so it's just, it's helpful to have a more robust view in that regard, because it helps us to approach our care as a more whole person oriented strategy than just trying to do one, or the other.
Let's say I have a friend who has postpartum depression, and she is well enough to try to figure out, what can I do to help myself? So she decides, I'm going to exercise, and I'm going to walk, and I'm going to do all those things, and that's going to get my framework in a different place. And so that is good. What you're saying is that's a good thing to do, is to take care of your body. But there is another realm, which is the spiritual realm, that is still broken and hurting. And what you're saying is you have to give attention to that as well. And some of the things that you shared, I have to admit, I'm not experiencing postpartum depression, but I was imagining, obviously I'm 76. I've never experienced it, but I have friends who have, and it's so hard, so painful. At that time when I was that young, back in my 20s, I didn't know how to help them, how to help them move forward. But I know that they would try different things to try to get better. And some of those things might work for a little while, but not for another. So I was thinking about them as I was reading your booklet, and I was tearful because I thought if they could have read this, they would say, "This girl gets me. This writer gets me. She's touching the nerves that feel so broken right now." And so there were, I think there were 4 areas that you talked about that we need to pay attention to, but where the Lord gives us that a comfort and an encouragement. It may not change the circumstances that we're in. We may still be experiencing those dark places of that postpartum depression, but there's medicine for our soul through our relationship to the Lord. Do you want to touch on that? One of the things that you talked about, which was our physical well-being, that I thought was really well. You said we are made of dust, so we are weak. It's okay for us to recognize we are weak. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that would help us when we are in this broken place of depression?
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you just for sharing your reflections there, Sharon. I was tearing up at your tearing up and what you said, because it's really the heart of this mini book is that I wish I had somebody telling me these things.
Yes.
And that's what's hard looking back and saying, oh, this is how I got out of it. And it's like, well, God, by his grace, got me out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really help a whole lot myself, on that journey. But this is what I wish this is what I see in hindsight that I wish I would have known, because then I wouldn't have beaten myself up so hard for struggling so badly.
Yeah.
Because God doesn't do that to us. He does not deal harshly with those who are with young, right? Isaiah talks about that he carries us and he deals gently with those who are with young. And I did not deal gently with myself during this time. I forgot, right, that what you're talking about in terms of how we're designed is that we are designed as weak and needy creatures. Like, God does not ask us to have total self-knowledge. He does not put the puzzle of depression before us and say, here, figure this out. Good luck. He knows how we are made. He remembers our frame. He knows that we are dust, and he has compassion on us still. And so just remembering that, my weaknesses, my limitations, the fact that I felt like I wasn't strong and capable, like, I am a creature. This is not a newsflash to God that this is how I am. But in the postpartum season, sometimes it can be a newsflash to us, because I went into this thing, talking about this thing, that's not maybe a great way to say it, but the third child, I was like, I'm a mom, I'm a pro, if anyone's got this, quotes, like, I've got this, it's gotta be me. But I've done this before.
Yeah.
But I did it in different situations. There was no help in looking to the past and saying, well, I did it before, how come I'm struggling now? Because the reality was, it was hard for me now.